Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise and get straight into the essential thinking that shapes our world. Today, we're wrestling with one of the biggest, structural paradoxes in modern political life.
Right, this huge tension between two very different ways of doing politics.
Exactly. On one side, you have these highly centralized, leader-driven populist movements. Think of, figures like Orban.
The ones that really prioritize efficiency and actually seizing power.
And then on the other side, you have these horizontal, decentralized movements.
Leaderless movements like Occupy Wall Street or maybe the Zapatistas, which are so often praised for their commitment to radical democracy and individual autonomy.
And that right there is the paradox we really can't ignore.
That's a massive one.
While those leaderless horizontal movements get all the praise from proponents of radical democracy, it is consistently the centralized, leader-driven populist approach that seems to be more successful.
Way more successful at seizing state power and then actually materializing these large-scale political projects.
Right. It's like efficiency always seems to fall on the side of verticality.
And that empirical fact, it just forces us to look beyond the day-to-day political commentary.
And to go deeper.
We have to dive into the theoretical architecture of leader-driven populism itself.
Yeah.
And our sources for today, they guide us straight to the work of Ernesto Laclau.
A theorist whose framework is, it's not just central to academic debate.
Not at all. It's been strategically adopted by major left populist movements in the real world.
So our mission today is very specific. We really need to dissect Laclau's dense theory of how these populist collectives are formed.
And specifically to identify the exact structurally required role of the leader within that formation.
We're going to trace his really surprising theoretical pivots, including a deep dive into Freudian psychoanalysis.
Which is not where you'd expect a political theorist to go.
Not at all. And crucially, we have to locate the vulnerabilities. We need to find the parts of the theory that stay underdeveloped, the parts that critics argue basically provide the structural blueprint for authoritarianism.
And that brings us to the central question for this whole deep dive.
Is Laclau's framework for populist leadership inherently authoritarian?
And if it isn't, why does its structure so consistently, almost magnetically, invite that critique from nearly every corner of political theory?
To answer that, we have to start by confronting those critiques head-on.
Okay, let's unpack this and see why this theoretical structure generates so much suspicion.
So when we talk about populist leadership, we're not just talking about any popular politician.
No, this is a very specific type of charismatic, highly centralized leadership.
And it's one that is frequently denounced as, fundamentally incompatible with the principles and institutions of liberal democracy.
The foundational worry is a normative one. It's about values. Is this structure just inevitably going to undermine democratic pluralism?
And the most articulate philosophical argument for this really comes from Jan Werner Müller.
Right. His critique just zeroes in on what he calls the anti-pluralist claim.
Which he says is the rhetorical heart of all populist movements.
Exactly. And that claim is what?
It's that the leader and the movement, they alone represent the true people.
Precisely. Mueller's point is that the populist leader doesn't just claim to speak for a big chunk of society.
No, it's much more totalizing.
It is. They claim that they and they alone represent the people. And that isn't just, political hyperbole. It has devastating political consequences for a functioning democracy.
How so?
Well, if the leader embodies the singular, authentic will of the people, then logically, what does that make everyone who disagrees?
They're not part of the people anymore.
They're not. Opposition parties, institutions, even just dissenting citizens, they're no longer seen as legitimate, equal citizens engaging in healthy democratic debate.
They become, in effect, outcasts, or even enemies of the people itself. They are, by definition, outside the perimeter of what's considered legitimate.
Exactly. And this rhetorical move is what allows the populist leader to bypass established norms, to attack checks and balances, to delegitimize courts.
All while claiming they're just acting on behalf of this unified, authentic will of the people against some shadowy enemy.
Right, against the elites or foreign interests or whatever. And that rhetorical move is why critics see this framework as just inherently corrosive to things like the separation of powers and civil contestation.
And this concern, it isn't just limited to democratic norms. It actually stretches into the really frightening territory of what's called the proto-totalitarian concern.
That's a term used by Kohn Abitz and Stefan Rummens. And it suggests that populism isn't just flawed, it actually contains the latent danger of totalizing political control.
So it's a seed that could grow into something much worse.
Yeah, it's their argument. Abbots and Rumman say that populism is proto-totalitarian because it shares a critical feature with actual totalitarian regimes.
And that is
The construction of a fictitious image of the people as one.
this idea that the people are a monolithic, unified entity with a single will.
Right, which is philosophically anti-pluralist at its core. And when a single leader then claims to be the vessel for that monolithic will, I mean, you can see the path to totalizing control pretty clearly.
The danger is in the structural attempt to just erase all internal difference and dissent in the name of unity.
That's the fear. And we see this echoed in the structural critique from Hart and Negri, too.
They suggest that even when populism seems to be this bottom-up champion of the marginalized, it's fundamentally conservative in its structure.
Yeah, Hart and Negri see these movements as performing constant lip service to the power of the people.
But in reality,
There's ultimate control and decision-making by a small clique of politicians. They're deeply suspicious that populist movements just occupy the existing structures of power, what they call the offices of domination, without fundamentally challenging the verticality of that power structure.
so for them, it's just a democratic facade over the same old oppressive system.
A new boss, same as the old boss, just with more popular rhetoric.
So if these critiques all share a common target, it's this inherent problem of power concentration and verticality.
Right.
And that vector points directly at Laclau, whose theory is criticized specifically for granting the leader such a central, irreplaceable role. Why are critics like Arado, Arditi, and Bellacci so troubled by the Laclauian structure specifically?
Because the theory provides the philosophical mechanism for that anti-pluralist claim Mueller talks about. It offers this really sophisticated explanation for why a single leader must stand in for the diverse demands of the people.
So it gives a theoretical justification for what critics see as a dangerous practice.
Exactly. This centrality, even if Laclau intended it to be a democratically accountable function, just generates these deep concerns about authoritarianism and the inevitable slide toward a cult of personality.
So they're arguing the structure itself, just by requiring this singular nodal point, is fundamentally biased toward verticality.
Right? Regardless of the theorist's own democratic intentions, the machine is built to centralize power.
And as we know, this theoretical unease found, well, very concrete expression in the real world. The rise and evolution of Podemos in Spain is often cited as the perfect case study.
It really is a movement that explicitly referenced Laclau and most left populist strategy.
It's the ultimate cautionary tale.
It is, because Podemos began with the radical, horizontal impulse of the Indignados movement. It promised internal democracy, grassroots control, all of that.
But then what happened?
Yet over time, the practical pressures of political organization and, just electoral competition led to a gradual, undeniable concentration of power in the hands of its leader, Pablo Iglesias.
And scholars have tracked this shift pretty meticulously.
Oh yeah, they've documented this shift away from horizontalism toward a much more centralized vertical authority.
And what's so crucial here is that this wasn't some external imposition, it was an internal structural consequence.
Precisely. The movement consolidated power. It adopted a more traditional party structure, and it focused authority on the central leadership figure.
Which just confirmed the critics' suspicion.
It did. It showed that even when you launch with these radical democratic aims, the structural requirement for an efficient, singular leadership, the very element Laclau argues is necessary for mobilization, seems to lead empirically to the consolidation of vertical power.
And this just deepens that central theoretical challenge for us.
It's the core question. How do you prevent the necessary leadership function from becoming a necessary authoritarian form?
That structural challenge means we absolutely have to dive into Laclau's own definitions.
We have to. If the critics are so worried about this inherent verticality, how does Laclau justify the leader's necessity while still claiming the whole structure can remain democratic?
And the answer begins with his core assertion that populism is a political logic. It's not an ideology or a type of movement.
That's the absolutely necessary pivot you have to make to understand him. Laclau is just adamant about this. Populism isn't defined by its content. It's not inherently right-wing or left-wing. It's not tied to a specific class.
It's a mode of calculation.
It's a logic, or a grammar, as he calls it, that governs the type of relations between entities. And this logic is what fundamentally challenges or transforms the existing rules of a political order.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. What does transforming the grammar of a practice actually mean? Can you give us an analogy to sort of anchor this complex idea?
Sure. Think of it like a game. The existing political system has a set of rules. That's the established grammar.
Okay.
When populism operates as a logic, it's not just asking for a better outcome within those rules. It's challenging the rules themselves.
So it's not trying to win the game, it's trying to change how the game is played.
Exactly. For example, when historical movements contested voting rights, they weren't just demanding better representation. They were demanding a change in the grammar of citizenship itself. They were transforming who even counts as a political subject. Populism is the logic that produces a collective subject powerful enough to rewrite that fundamental grammar.
And underpinning all of this is a deep commitment to anti-essentialism.
Which is a major, major break from older Marxist theories of how subjects are formed.
Right, because orthodox Marxism would claim that a collective subject, like the working class, had an essential, fixed identity.
An a priori identity defined by their objective economic position in the mode of production. Laclau just completely rejects this.
For him, identity is contingent.
Totally. The identity of any collective subject is entirely contingent, temporary, and non-fixed. A political identity is not found. It is formed politically through struggle and engagement.
And this formation happens through this key mechanism he calls articulation. Can you walk us through that definition and why it's so significant?
So, articulation is defined as any practice establishing a relation among elements such that their identity is modified as a result of the articulatory practice.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is, but the key is that their identity is modified. If, say, 3 business owners unite to lobby for lower taxes based on their pre-existing shared interests, that's just a transactional alliance.
Their identities don't change.
Right. In Laclau's populism, the very act of linking different demands together changes the meaning of each individual demand.
So if a demand for better wages gets articulated alongside a demand for environmental justice, those two distinct demands start to color and redefine each other within this new collective identity.
Exactly. It's not just a collection anymore, it's a political alchemy. The local is modified by the general, and the general gets colored by the local. And this whole process begins with the smallest unit of analysis in Laclau's universe.
The demand.
The demand.
And demands are just expressions of dissatisfaction aimed at an authority, a pothole, unemployment, poor school funding, simple stuff.
Right. Most of those demands are met, and they just disappear. The populist logic only kicks in when the system, the ruling authority, fails structurally and repeatedly to respond.
That failure is the foundational moment.
It is. The specific content of the demand suddenly matters less than its structural status as being unmet or unsatisfied.
And when all these demands pile up and remain unsatisfied, they become structurally equivalent.
Because of their shared status of being denied by the power structure, that shared failure is the glue.
Or at least the initial catalyst.
Right, it's the catalyst.
Yeah.
But to gain any kind of political consistency, this shared failure needs to coalesce into 2 intertwined developments. The first is the equivalential chain.
Okay, what's that?
This is the complex process where highly heterogeneous demands, a demand for racial parity in policing, a demand for infrastructure investment, and a demand for better retirement funding, all link up.
And these demands have no necessary intrinsic connection in terms of their content.
None whatsoever. So they are linked purely by the formal status of their denial by the political system.
They're equivalent only in their common difference from the ruling order.
Precisely. And what's really crucial here is that the chain does not dissolve the difference. The demand for infrastructure funding doesn't suddenly become the demand for racial justice. They remain distinct, but they're linked, forming this precarious chain of frustrated subjects against a common enemy.
And that leads directly to the second development, which is the creation of antagonism.
The failure to meet the demands creates a fundamental chasm in the political space.
The world is split in 2.
It is. On one side, you have this burgeoning collective subject of the unsatisfied. And on the other, you have the entity, the establishment, the oligarchy, the swamp, that is structurally responsible for the denial. This entity is defined as the antagonistic enemy.
Which is why slogans are so powerful.
Immensely. Whether it's Drain the Swamp or Que se vayan todos in Argentina, these slogans work because they name this common enemy, and in doing so, they unify all those heterogeneous demands.
But this complex chain of equivalent demands, even linked by antagonism, still sounds really volatile.
It is.
So Laclau needs to explain why mere dissatisfaction and a shared enemy aren't enough. Why does this risk remaining just what Hannah Arendt called a mob? a temporary reactive crowd.
That's the critical insufficiency he identifies. Antagonism and equivalence provide a vague solidarity, but they don't forge a durable collective political subject that's capable of sustained action and strategic coordination.
So you need a stronger adhesive to hold that radically diverse chain together.
Absolutely. Think about the variety. One person wants better wages, another wants cleaner water, a third wants protection from foreign competition. The only thing they share is their rejection by the current system.
Shared negation.
And that shared negation is powerful, but it's also fragile. To become a unified affirmative political subject, to become the people, you need a point of unity that can stand in for the entire equivalential chain.
And this is where the leader comes in.
Structurally, theoretically, and politically, this is where the populist leader enters the picture. The leadership function becomes a necessity to stabilize and give meaning to the otherwise fleeting collective identity.
Okay, so the leader is structurally necessary to transform this precarious mob into a unified political subject.
Right.
But why does Laclau then make this very surprising jump into psychoanalysis to justify this necessity? This is where we hit section 3. His critical reinterpretation of Freud's mass psychology and analysis of the I.
It is a provocative move. Because as you mentioned earlier, critics like Theodor Adorno saw Freud's text as basically describing the psychological mechanisms of authoritarian identification.
The very mechanisms that allowed for the rise of figures like Hitler.
Exactly. So Laclau's immense task here is to somehow draw a theoretical blueprint for non-authoritarian leadership out of a text that's traditionally associated with the mechanics of the authoritarian mass.
So let's start with Freud's key insight. What differentiated him from the 19th century crowd theorists like Gustave Le Bon?
Well, Le Bon and others focus mostly on things like emotional contagion and the resulting debasement of the individual in the crowd.
The idea that crowds make people stupid and irrational.
Basically, yeah. And Freud shifted the focus from the volatile behavior of the crowd to the internal structure of the group's bond. He argued that Le Bon missed the deep psychological forces at play.
He thought there had to be something deeper holding them together.
Right. Freud insisted that if individuals are bound together to form an entity, there must be a profound force binding them. And for him, this force isn't just intellectual consensus or shared interest, it's libidinal ties. It's eros.
Eros, the life force, the desire for connection. In a political sense, what are these libidinal ties?
They manifest as these complex psychological attachments that organize the group. And Freud identified a dual structure of ties that hold the group together through the leader.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first tie is vertical. It's the relationship between the leader and each individual follower.
This is the tie of idealization.
Exactly. The individual follower places the leader in the position of their ego ideal, that standard of perfection they wish to attain, and grants the leader this profound emotional authority.
And the second tie is the horizontal one, between the followers themselves.
That is the tie of identification. The followers identify with each other because they all share a common attachment. That is, they all idealize the same leader.
So the group is unified not by what they share intrinsically, but by their common relationship to the leader. It's like, I'm like you because we both look up to him.
That's the Freudian model in a nutshell.
Now, if we start right there, this model seems to inevitably lead to a narcissistic, authoritarian leader.
It really does. The ultimate object of idealization in a strictly hierarchical relationship.
So Laclau needs a theoretical counterforce to stop this automatic slide into despotism.
And that's the genius of his rereading of Freud. He finds this counterforce in the notion of organization, an idea Freud actually borrowed and expanded on from a psychologist named William McDougall.
Okay, so McDougall distinguished between unstable, volatile mobs and stable, organized masses.
Right, like armies or churches. And what was the defining feature of the organized mass?
Organization itself.
Yes, McDougall and Freud argued that organization prevents the stereotypical debasement of individual intellect and morality that you see in mobs. Organization restores the intellectual and moral qualities that once characterized the individual before they joined the mass.
So organization acts as a safeguard. It prevents the follower from just dissolving their individual identity and intellect into the mass's emotional energy.
Precisely. Organization is the institutional, structural mechanism that maintains the distance between the follower's individual ego and the leader as their ego ideal.
And using this, Laclau can then posit that populist leadership is not an all-or-nothing proposition.
Exactly. It exists on a continuum, a spectrum.
Where the purely narcissistic leader and the fully organized group are the two impossible extremes.
And every real-world group balances this authoritarian idealization, this verticality, with organization and identification, or horizontality. The political form, whether it's democratic or authoritarian, is determined by where on that spectrum the movement resides.
And this is Laclau's critical opening.
It is. It's how he can claim that leadership is structurally necessary, but its form is contingent and potentially democratic.
But how does he support this non-authoritarian possibility using Freud's own text? He points to a very specific passage.
Yes, this is the linchpin of his argument. He focuses on where Freud notes that the leader need only possess the typical properties of such individuals in a particularly pure and well-defined form.
Which seems like a simple statement, but Laclau pulls a lot from it.
He does. This passage is vital because it shifts the locus of the relationship from pure love for the leader, that's idealization, to shared qualities with the leader, that's identification. And he draws three crucial consequences from this that reveal the democratic potential.
Okay, walk us through those three consequences. How does this open up a space for democratic identification?
First, the led are no longer united only by their passive love for the leader. They share common features that the leader successfully embodies in this pure and well-defined form.
So the bond is now based on a shared identity, not just devotion.
Right. Second, because these common features exist, the relationship is marked by a robust horizontal identification among the followers, not just a vertical idealization of the leader. And this identification is what strengthens the organization.
And the third consequence is the critical one for accountability.
It is. The third insight is that the leader cannot be purely despotic. Their authority is now tethered to their ability to continue demonstrating those shared, typical properties of the mass.
Which provides a form of constraint.
It's a major constraint. If the leader deviates too far from the group's shared identity, which is preserved by the organization, their authority is undermined, and followers have the option to withdraw their support.
So the accountability mechanism is built directly into the leader's representative necessity.
Yes. Organization preserves the shared individual qualities, and the leader must reflect them. If the group dissolves into a mob where the only shared quality is the love for the leader, then accountability completely vanishes.
Which leads us to the qualitative difference between these two modes of identification.
Right, which our sources define based on the idea of fullness versus lack, drawing on later psychoanalytic thought.
This distinction seems crucial for understanding the political behavior of followers. Let's start with vertical identification, the authoritarian mode, which operates on the principle of phantasmatic fullness.
The authoritarian relationship, which relies overwhelmingly on idealization, is a phantasmatic one. The followers idealize the leader as the complete solution, the embodiment of impossible perfection.
The one who guarantees fullness.
And the total elimination of all lack or ambiguity in political life. They believe that if the leader is in charge, all problems will be solved and the social order will be complete.
And this is the ideological basis for denying all facts that contradict the leader's authority.
It is. But horizontal identification, the democratic mode, is the sublimated one. It recognizes lack.
What does that mean, sublimated?
Sublimation, in this context, is the political maturity that recognizes the necessary lack that defines real political life. It means accepting that no leader is perfect, no solution is total, and political struggle involves constant negotiation and the impossibility of achieving pure fullness.
So this kind of identification is aware that the leader is not a full incarnation of their shared qualities.
Right, which fundamentally preserves the space for contestation and democratic negotiation.
This gives us the accountability metric we need to map out Laclau's spectrum. The degree of accountability is directly inverse to the degree of this phantasmatic idealization.
Exactly. In the highly democratic model, based on horizontal identification, followers share a broad, organizationally preserved list of qualities with the leader. They know the leader is imperfect, which means they have leverage.
They can withdraw support if the leader moves too far away from their shared identity.
And accountability is high, because the leader's authority is understood to be temporary and delegated.
Whereas in the authoritarian model, the leader is the guarantor of fullness.
The absolute ideal. Because the relationship is phantasmatic, there's no room for contestation regarding their decisions. Any attack on the leader is seen as an attack on the fullness the followers are seeking.
And that's why you get that pathological response.
Yes, the more media or institutional critiques attack the leader, the more those followers double down. They're effectively saying, the more the system tries to expose the lack, the more we love the leader who promises fullness. That is the sure sign of the vertical authoritarian slide.
Okay, so Laclau seems to have successfully established that the leadership function, while necessary for group unity, can adopt a non-authoritarian form.
Right, provided that the necessary counterforce of organization is present.
But then he takes another conceptual turn, introducing Lacanian concepts that, at first glance, seem to drag him right back to the structural necessity of hierarchy.
This is where we need to reconcile the two psychoanalytic movements in his work. He agrees with Freud that the symbolic unification of the group around an individuality is inherent to the formation of the mass.
So he's reinforcing the necessity of the leadership function.
He is. But he clarifies that his book shouldn't be conceived as a Freudian venture because he's using Lacan to understand the structural role of the signifier.
And he introduces this Lacan-inspired notion of the name of the leader as a nodal point. Can you define what this means in terms of the signifier?
Sure. We're moving from the psychological mechanics of the individual, which was Freud's focus, to the structural function of language and authority, which is Lacan's focus. The name of the leader functions as the point de capiton.
The quilting point.
The quilting point. Think of a quilted mattress. The stitching holds all the disparate elements of the mattress together, fixing their positions and preventing them from sliding apart.
So the name acts as this metaphorical stitch that fixes the otherwise slippery identities of all those heterogeneous demands.
It prevents the chain of equivalence from dissolving into meaningless chaos. It fixes the identity. We can also connect this to the Lacanian concept of name of the father.
Which isn't a person.
No, it's a structural signifier representing law, order, and authority that organizes the symbolic realm. And the critical Lacanian insight for Laclau is that the function of the point de capiton, this organizational stitch, need not be fulfilled by an actual living, breathing leader.
It could be an abstract idea.
It could be a constitution or the name of a party. It's a structural locus that needs filling.
Now let's return to the full sequence of the populist logic and trace how that equivalential chain leads to this structural requirement for a singular name.
Okay, so we have the equivalential logic. Diverse demands linked by shared dissatisfaction.
Right.
This leads to singularity, where one demand starts to represent the entire chain. Now, for this one demand to represent a whole chain of highly diverse and contradictory needs, from local potholes to national immigration policy, it has to undergo a process of emptying.
Emptying means shedding its specific particular content, correct?
Yes. The specific content of that singular demand just erodes. It becomes an empty signifier, a word that doesn't mean anything in particular, but it stands for everything that is lacking or wrong.
It becomes a vessel for pure discontent.
Right. And when the demands are extremely heterogeneous, covering issues from local neighborhood safety to global economic structure, it's incredibly difficult for an abstract idea like freedom or social justice to capture everything.
And this is why the name of the leader becomes the ultimate structural necessity in the case of radical populism.
Precisely. Laclau argues that an individuality, a singular name, is the extreme form of singularity. It's the most efficient, least content-specific vessel capable of carrying that completely emptied signifier, representing the radical heterogeneity of the people. The name is the ultimate nodal point, simultaneously simple and infinitely capable of absorbing contradictions.
And this is where the empirical example of Donald Trump is so illuminating, as our sources suggest.
It's a perfect example. Look at how his name functioned as the central empty signifier. It was able to accommodate these radically heterogeneous and often contradictory demands.
You had xenophobic cultural protectionism on one hand.
And the demand for social conservatism, but also the demands of global financial neoliberalism from Wall Street, and simultaneously the demands of disenfranchised miners in the Rust Belt, whose jobs were actively undermined by that very same neoliberal agenda.
Only the emptied singularity of the leader's name could hold those warring factions in a unified chain of equivalence.
Absolutely. Any specific policy or ideology would have instantly shattered that coalition.
The name itself is the point de capiton.
It is. And this brings us back to that apparent regression. If the ultimate case of populism requires an individuality, the name of the leader, doesn't this just reintroduce the hierarchy Laclau was trying to diffuse with his concept of organization?
So how does he resolve this seeming contradiction?
By distinguishing between function and form, the tension is only apparent. Lacan reinforced the necessity of the leadership function, the structural requirement for a particularity, be it a name, an ideal, or a person, to represent the ensemble.
And Freud explored the form this function takes.
Exactly. Authoritarian or democratic based on that idealization-identification balance.
So the conclusion remains stable. Laclau reinforces the ineradicability of the leadership function. Something has to serve as the nodal point, regardless of the form that function adopts.
Absolutely. However, this resolution really highlights Laclau's central preoccupation. His analysis is predominantly interested in the formal and structural dimensions of populism. He is rigorous about why the function exists and how it structures discourse.
But he's less concerned with the actual content.
Much less concerned with the actual content that fills that function, whether it's a genuinely democratic leader or a fascist, or critically, how to prevent that necessary symbolic leadership function from devolving into dictatorial material leadership. And that gap is what fuels the critic's persistent worry.
That focus on formalism leads us directly to the major empirical ambiguity that constantly dogs Laclau's framework: the Peronism problem.
Right.
Laclau uses Juan Perón's movement in Argentina as a constant touchstone for his theory, yet critics and historians almost unanimously describe Peronism as having profound, undeniable authoritarian traits.
This really forces us to test the theory against historical reality. Historically, Perón's regime concentrated all powers in the executive. It adopted a vertical structure influenced by interwar totalitarian traditions.
Even as it was, undeniably, a popular democratizing force that incorporated the previously excluded working classes.
For sure. But historians like Romero and De La Torre describe his methods as profoundly centralized.
And Perón's own words often reflected this hierarchical view. He famously stated that the masses do not think, the masses feel.
And that their worth derived from the quality of the men who lead it, a sentiment that sounds far, far closer to the authoritarian end of Laclau's spectrum than the democratic one.
So the theoretical challenge is, how does Laclau, the champion of democratic strategy, use such an empirically authoritarian example to define his populist logic?
He does this by focusing on Peronism's failure and its subsequent reliance on absence.
So he identifies the key period not as Perón's time in office in the 40s and 50s.
No, but his long exile after the 1955 coup. He argues that this necessity for absence was ironically the movement's most successful phase in creating equivalence.
How so?
Perón maintained his influence through highly ambiguous personal correspondence sent from Madrid. And this correspondence was strategically crucial because it forced radically diverse and contradictory factions within the Peronist movement, from revolutionary left-wing guerrillas to conservative union bureaucrats and right-wing nationalists, to interpret his vague words freely.
So the ambiguity of his written word allowed for a radical emptying of the signifier.
Absolutely. Perón's name and his ambiguous letters served as the perfect empty signifier, allowing these mutually antagonistic groups to unite under one banner, creating an almost unlimited chain of equivalences.
This phase illustrates the populist logic's structural necessity for an empty signifier to unify difference.
It does. So the success of Peronism in constructing the widest possible collective identity was predicated on his physical and political absence, which allowed his name to function purely as an emptied signifier.
And that's the paradox.
It is. The success led directly to the failure. What happened upon his return to Argentina in 1973?
The moment he returned and assumed the presidency, the equivalence was subverted. He had to stop being an empty signifier and start being a particular material leader.
He had to make concrete, particular policy decisions. And that process of emptying had to be reversed and filled with specific content. This immediate jarring shift just shattered the coalition.
The left-wing and right-wing factions broke apart.
They broke into fierce and often violent struggle. The coalition disintegrated almost instantly, proving that Perón's name had been the only link holding the equivalents together.
This disintegration confirms the theoretical argument about the fragility of a collective identity built solely around the leader's name.
It does.
But when we juxtapose Laclau's own description of this phenomenon with his earlier psychoanalytic definitions, the nature of Perón's leadership becomes starkly clear.
This is the definitive moment for this section. Laclau explicitly described Peronism as the extreme situation in which love for the father is the only link between the brothers.
Okay, now let's recall his own definition of the authoritarian end of the political spectrum.
Derived from Freud. That end describes cases where the ground of any identification would exclusively be the common love for the leader.
The comparison is damning. The phrases are almost identical.
They are. Based on Laclau's own theoretical definitions of the spectrum, Perón must be conceived as an authoritarian leader. The empirical and descriptive evidence aligns perfectly with the definition of authoritarian verticality.
But this does not undermine Laclau's theory.
No, and this is a key point. The theoretical consistency is maintained because the theory clearly acknowledges authoritarianism as a structural possibility within the populist logic, not a contradiction of it.
So the problem isn't one of coherence, it's one of strategic implications.
Exactly, and the ambiguity remains. Laclau provides this powerful, detailed example of the authoritarian potential in Peronism, but he conspicuously fails to offer an equally strong, detailed, empirical example of a genuinely democratic, horizontal populist leadership that has successfully navigated the complexities of power seizure under his logic.
And that asymmetry in his empirical focus only amplifies the critic's concerns.
It really does. It deepens the suspicion that the theory's structural leaning is, in practice, toward verticality.
So we've established the theoretical consistency. The leadership function is necessary, but the form is contingent. It could be authoritarian or democratic.
Right.
Since the theory itself isn't inherently authoritarian, the relevant question shifts entirely to strategy.
It has to. The question becomes, under what conditions does the necessary leadership function turn authoritarian rather than democratic?
And here we finally arrive at the core theoretical deficiency, the strategic blow.
We do. Laclau offers an abstract framework for measuring this spectrum, drawn from Freud's psychoanalysis. He says the relationship between the leader and the led is determined by the distance between the follower's ego and their ego ideal.
Okay, let's try to clarify those terms in a socio-political sense, based on Laclau's adoption of them. The leader, as the object of idealization, is posited as the ego ideal.
Correct. The ego ideal is the standard of perfection, the unified ideal of the collective identity, which the leader embodies. The individual follower is the ego.
So when the distance between the follower's imperfect individual ego and the leader as the perfect ego ideal increases,
the relationship becomes more authoritarian, more idealization, less organization.
And when the distance decreases, when the leader is seen as more of a peer, only slightly better or purer,
it's more democratic, more horizontal identification, more organization.
It's an elegant theoretical metric, but it is entirely abstract, and this is where the deficiency lies.
It's the core flaw. Laclau himself acknowledged that Freud's psychoanalytic categories obviously require a structural reformulation to be useful as tools of sociopolitical analysis.
They're designed for the internal mental life of a subject, not for mass mobilization or institutional structure.
Right. But Laclau fails to provide that reformulation. He doesn't define what the ego and the ego ideal actually mean in terms of political organization, cultural values, or economic status.
He leaves them as abstract psychological terms.
He does. And without clarifying what the socio-political reference of the ego and ego ideal are, we lose two critical abilities. And this just cripples the strategic utility of the theory.
The first is the ability to even measure the distance itself.
You can't measure what you can't define. If we don't know the characteristics of the ego, the follower's actual organized identity and the ego ideal, the leader's idealization, we can't establish whether a movement is approaching the authoritarian pole or the democratic pole. The metric is a phantom.
And the second, and I think more devastating loss, is the ability to determine causation.
Yes, since we can't define the components, we can't determine the causal links. We can only observe correlation.
For instance, we can note that in times of extreme economic distress, movements tend toward authoritarian leadership.
But we can't specify how to modify political organization, that missing element, to shrink the distance between the ego and the ego ideal. We can't say, if you implement X internal organizational rule, the distance will shrink.
This structural void means that the concept of organization, the key counterforce Laclau identified to prevent the slide into vertical idealization, remains frustratingly underdeveloped.
It's the mechanism that's supposed to close the distance, but we have no theoretical map for how to deploy it.
And this creates a severe strategic blow for anyone attempting to use Laclau's theory as a foundation for radical democratic change.
It does. Without specifying the mechanisms to measure or alter that distance, the framework provides no guidance for empirical analysis. You can't predict if a movement will consolidate democratically or authoritarianly, nor does it offer practical prescriptive advice for political organizers.
This brings the strategic debate into really sharp focus, particularly the clash between the proponents of left populist efficiency, like Chantal Mouffe, and those who prioritize the transformation of power itself, like Hart and Negri.
Right. Mouffe favors adopting a left populist strategy largely because of its demonstrated efficiency. She argues that horizontalist movements often fail to achieve political outcomes because they can't effectively mobilize a broad, heterogeneous base or materialize their demands against established power.
For Mouffe, the ability to mobilize and win efficiency is the primary yardstick.
Even if it necessitates strong, centralized leadership efficiency over pure horizontal purity.
But Hart and Negri push back on this, and they push back strongly, arguing that efficiency cannot be the sole measure of radical success.
Their critique is fundamental. They claim that simply filling the offices of domination with better leaders, even if they're left-wing or genuinely well-intentioned, is just insufficient for genuine transformation. The goal cannot be merely to seize power within the existing political structure.
The goal, for Hart and Negri, must be to fundamentally alter the form of power, not just the content.
They argue that the aim must be to take power, not simply by occupying the existing offices, but instead by altering fundamentally the relationships that power designates and thus transforming power itself.
So they would prioritize the horizontal form, internal democracy, and collective self-governance, even if it sacrifices the short-term efficiency required to win elections.
That's the trade-off they seem willing to make.
And this is where Laclau's theoretical deficiency becomes a real strategic liability for Mouffe's position.
It does, because his account of the authoritarian versus democratic distinction is so underdeveloped, relying on these abstract psychoanalytic terms. The framework provides a questionable basis for supporting a left populist strategy that promises a horizontally oriented democratic future.
The theory just doesn't provide the safeguards.
It fails to adequately address the mechanism by which you ensure that political efficiency, the necessity of the leadership function, doesn't automatically sacrifice the democratic form of power. It's a risk the theory acknowledges, but doesn't provide the tools to mitigate.
So we have completed our deep dive into the ambiguities of populist leadership, and we've charted a fascinating path.
A really complex one.
We've confirmed the theoretical coherence of Laclau's framework. The leadership function is structurally required to unite heterogeneous demands, and the framework absolutely acknowledges both authoritarian and democratic forms.
The coherence lies in its structural formalism, but the strategic utility of that formalism is severely limited by its theoretical ambiguities.
And the most crucial deficiencies are that lack of a sociopolitical definition for the ego and ego ideal,
which prevents us from ever measuring the distance between leader and led, and the subsequent underdevelopment of the concept of organization, which is supposed to be the democratic counterforce.
The lesson here really feels diagnostic. The next crucial steps for political theorists and organizers must involve filling these gaps.
Yes, providing concrete, measurable definitions for these psychoanalytic concepts in sociopolitical terms, and theorizing the practical ways in which organization can be structured to prevent democratic horizontal identifications from slipping into these vertical, phantasmatic idealizations.
And this isn't just, an academic challenge.
Not at all. It's the fundamental problem of radical political strategy. If you seek fundamental democratic transformation, you have to solve this efficiency paradox.
How can we develop a strategy powerful enough to mobilize real political power and achieve material change,
but organized enough to ensure that the seizure of power fundamentally transforms the form of domination itself, rather than simply replicating it with different faces?
Which leaves us with the final provocative thought for you to take away. What really stands out to you about this distinction between striving for political efficiency versus striving to fundamentally transform the form of power itself?
If achieving the first so often risks sacrificing the second, how can radical democratic aims be strategically pursued without being structurally compromised from the very beginning?
It is a complex task, and one we must hope that political actors are up to.